traveling through a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. But this is not the Twilight Zone, at least not yet. I'm Layman Pascal, and this is me hosting an episode of Awakening Wholeness with Geoff Fitch and Abigail Lynam on the theory of complexity, being competent at complexity, and the whole question of growing up or some kind of increase of complexity over time. End of introduction. Hi, friends.
Hi,
Hello.
Layman. Good to see you.
Great to be together again.
So I've been pondering complexity all day, and my mind went to kind of like my backstory on that. And also, I recently rewatched all the Jurassic Park movies and reread the original two Michael Crichton novels. And it really struck me how much I had responded as a child to the Jeff Goldblum character, who is the chaos scientist in those movies. When I was a kid in the 90s, that was probably my first introduction to what we now would call complexity science. And after that movie, I got books on fractals and learned about Mandelbrot and bifurcation. And there were a lot of people at the time getting turned on by this notion that science was no longer just mechanistic reduction, that now it was starting to include unpredictable natural patterns and some kind of organic logic of the richness of living systems. And I think that's part of what led me to be interested in developmental systems that viewed complexity as a marker for the unfolding of human being or human understanding of reality. It helped lead me to philosophers and scientists who took seriously the idea that most things don't work like simple machines, that there's animate parts with inanimate parts interconnected in various ways, that do things that not only you couldn't have predicted from the parts, but in some ways you just can't ever guess what they're going to do. You have to live it out with them.
Mm.
All of that to me was awesome. I think I would much rather be a jungle than a factory. And all of that informs my sense of complexity as a positive, emerging, powerful feature of our understanding, as opposed to something we might demonize as being the enemy of simplicity and control. But I thought it would be interesting to hear a bit about your own journeys with the concept. Like, how did you come across the notion of complexity? What does it mean to you? How did you learn to appreciate it?
Mm. Yeah, no, I love that. I'm curious. I want to come back to your question, but I'm curious about your story that you just told, which when you started to have those insights into that kind of bigger view of the world, into complexity, into realizing that you're more like a jungle than a factory. What's the somatic experience of that?
It had a couple of components to it. I think one was I was always very attuned to somatic interoception, tracking it. Um, I think it helped me want to sink more deeply into that space as a kind of acoustic, omnidirectional darkness, like not a room with the lights on, but a dark room where a lot of things are moving around.
Mm.
It helped me desire to accept that space as one in which a lot of things were
Mm.
moving that I couldn't necessarily track, and that my job was not to pin them down, even though analytically there's some use to that. My job was to get more comfortable with that
Yeah, yeah.
multi-directional thing.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's
Uh,
cool, because often, we're talking about something, we're using the word complexity for it, and often when we use that word, it sort of provokes an image of something that's complicated and difficult to deal with. But you use that word comfortable, and to me, that's an important aspect of it. That like when you start to see something that has been beyond your view, or even in a dark room where you know that there's something there that you can't quite reach, but when your mind opens to a kind of perspective that can include more of that, it actually, in a certain kind of paradoxical way, it makes it simpler and more yeah, more comfortable. um, I was kind of thinking of this. We were doing some writing on this, and I had a metaphor that came to me, which was you, you know what a stereogram is? One of those like kind of two-dimensional
Magic Eyes
image.
3D.
Yeah, the
Magic
magic
eye.
eye thing, where it just looks like kind of gobbledygook. And then when you just sort of cross your eyes a little bit, all of a sudden this whole image comes in. And so it's kind of this movement of something that seems complicated to something that seems clearer and more simple, but you're actually seeing it with a different kind of complexity. I just thought of that as a metaphor, that. And so to me, like in my own journey, it's been repeatedly like that, like that movement into greater complexity is seeing something that, that once seemed contradictory or in opposition or me and not me, or something like that, that there's a greater whole that all of a sudden you can kind of conceive of it. And then there's a relaxation into that view, and things seem to make more sense. And so to me, it's a kind of a lining up of the way you're seeing the world with what aspect of the world you're contending with, and when that lines up, you're seeing it in a way that's like it's like appropriately complex for the situation, and that gives you more agility to move through it, more responsiveness. And I think in terms of my interest in the topic, it came through that the integral theory and exploration of developmental psychology, and yeah, interested in complexity science and those types of things, and kind of grappling with the world and being open to kind of a broader view. But it's also just been very personal as I've kind of gone through my own, challenging life experiences and grown my own inner complexity to meet them.
Good. I enjoy hearing about it. And I could sort of see my own life pattern reflected in, as you were sharing your own stories, Layman. And, I think I was reflecting about this too prior to our conversation. I've probably always been a little bit heat seeking for looking for that which was like right on the edge of or beyond my way of understanding or seeing. It's been an orientation probably my whole life. And although I also have memories of, I remember somebody asking me right when I finished high school, I had been part of a Christian group, which was a kind of anomaly in my family life. And the fellow who led that group, I'd left the group and I ran into him. He was also my science teacher in school. And he said, he was trying to sort of bring me back into the group. And he said something like, well, don't you want to know what happens when you die? And I said, my 18-year-old self said, I know what happens when I die. And that so-called certainty is, it's like that memory has always been there, because I knew at the time, even when I said it, there was a rub, but I was so convicted. I was more of a kind of materialist worldview. It's like, oh, my body's planted in the earth, and it gets absorbed by other creatures, and that's the kind of beginning and end of it. But it stood out because it was maybe I was startled by my own way of expressing myself. But yeah, I would say, like, for me, this showed up in I studied ecology when I was in my undergraduate studies, and really that already was a kind of seeking for deeper patterns. And then I remember towards the end of my degree, I took a class that really like dismantled all the paradigms that I'd been studying for the prior 4 years, and I couldn't have been more exhilarated. I could imagine maybe another would be disturbed and disoriented, like, well, what do I do with this now? Everything I thought I understood, I don't understand. But in this, but in that case, I felt enlivened and like, okay, we're kind of moving into territory that I'm not yet familiar with. And And so I can, over the course of my life, see many moments of that, of starting to realize like, oh, there's something beyond the apparent understanding that's gonna, that's gonna widen and deepen the view and give a whole new, bring a whole new world to light in a way. And yeah, so it's been very life-giving and something I have oriented to for some time.
I love the bit about the church group, and then when you kind of went back, found your materialist point of view, I was thinking about like your dad, and then I was remembering like my own similar experience with that, because at a young age I was really interested in, spirituality and mysticism and, the occult and anything that was kind of weird. And my dad was very much an atheist, kind of materialist. He was a doctor, scientist, and stuff like that. And the first Wilbur book I got really interested in was the Marriage of Sense and Soul, which was kind of like, I read that book and it was so exhilarating because I thought, oh, this resolves the argument that I've been having in my head with my dad all these years. So it's a kind of like wider view. So maybe that's the first transcendent include, is to transcend itself and father into some wider view.
So my ear is picking up what I think of as sort of structural features of how complexity unfolds and what it's like for complexity to have unfolded, like wider and some kind of expanse being increased. That's a very common experience in metaphor. In what Abigail was saying, I was really interested in the certainty about knowing what happens when we die. There's a confidence there, and it takes initially the form of acting like we know something, but then later there's a teasing apart. Ideally, we go, well, actually, maybe I don't know a lot of things. There's a huge zone of things that I don't know and maybe can't know, but I still have this confidence. And if I tease those apart, I can use that confidence to enter into this more omnidirectional and ambiguous and interacting field of things. Geoff's example of the stereogram is something I spent a lot of time as a teenager with stereograms, and then would try to like do it on the puzzle and then try to put the puzzle away and do it to like the wall or the woods or something like that. And I was like, oh, what's the mechanism? Because I really want this to happen in my whole life. And the mechanism was something like you don't quite go out of focus. You focus differently. It's like you focus to a different level of depth, and you're accessing a very coherent feeling other dimension somehow that requires you to let go and look really hard at the same time. So there's a concentration and there's a releasing. And the whole idea that it's a stereogram, that two things, the parallax, the overlap between two processing systems is what's needed. You couldn't do it with one eye. And maybe you can't do it with one concept or one perspective. You mentioned the me and the not me. There's all these ways in which like two zones of sense making, if you put them just right and kind of release and kind of focus, you see another set of patterns.
Yeah, no, I love that. It's the interesting. I was before the call. I was kind of pulling up a few stereograms because I hadn't done it in a while, and kind of looking at them. And part of the interesting experience for me is like when you get that focus right, like your brain and eyes seem to say, okay, this is the normal way to look, and it doesn't take any effort. All of a sudden, you just got kind of captured into that new view, and that new view seems normal. And it's one of the things that I think about this is just important to see, like from a constructive developmental point of view, where our view on the world, what this kind of topic that we're talking about is realizing that there's kind of you could say multiple views that we can take of the world, and those views are deep and complex and rich enough that they give rise to like a compelling like certainty about what we're experiencing. this one of the human experiences is our experience, unless, maybe there's some sort of dysfunction, is compelling. It's like we experience life and we go like, yeah, this is what it is. It's like kind of unarguable. And then when something opens, like what you're putting, like you're pointing to, you start to say, well, oh, maybe it wasn't what it is. That there's something new that I'm not seeing, and that's disorienting. And then something new takes shape, and then that seems compelling. So it's really interesting to, we go through this, and childhood development understanding is that we go through these stages, but at a certain point we become aware that we're going through them, and we start to see them happen in real time and start to reflect on our experience of them. And ultimately, I think this has like really deep implications for like human society, because we're now really interwoven and interconnected in the world with all of these different views and different realities that we're experiencing. So how do we come together when we're also kind of living in, to some degree, in different worlds? And so grappling with that and becoming more understanding of it and fluid with it is important. That was a little tour. I didn't know where I let off, but I'm aware of where I landed.
A lot of people, I mean, small percentage of the population, but there are still a lot of people who've begun to think over the last 100 years, let's say, in terms of some kind of level like accretion of maturational development. Right? And a lot of philosophers have some very simple versions where they just thought of changes from one paradigm to another, or one, two, or three levels. And we now inherit a number of people who've have more dramatic, 7, 12 subdivisions, multiple directionalities through them. A lot of work's been going into this. A lot of data has been accruing. It seems like there's something there. Most people understand it pretty clearly when they watch a child develop. They see it go through these phases, these increases of the ability to take more and more things into account. I found very much that in learning to assimilate these models, these philosophies, I had to stop periodically and say, did I actually experience anything like that, or am I just taking it for granted? And one of the things I would come across a lot was a moment where my dad took us out of the school. We moved to the Bahamas. This was in elementary school. We lived in the Bahamas for a while. Then we moved back to my little, very rural Canadian village. And all the kids there were the same. It was the same kids. And I'd be with them for years to come. But they were the same. And now I was a world traveler. I'd had all these experiences in this bigger space than them. And some dimension of normal peer pressure was just gone, right? Like they didn't have the ability to judge me anymore because I was operating in this other chess game that they were not aware of. I think about that with our kids in terms of one of the most important gifts to give them is a richness of experience, which allows them to make sense of themselves in the world in a way that puts them outside the reach of some of the normal social traps that they fall into. So that's one of the things, that's one of the places I go to in my own story. I wonder where you guys look at your own lives or even your own childhood and go, there was a moment in my life where I'm pretty sure that was a level up. I entered a more complex space.
Yeah. I could just offer a couple reflections, based on what you were sharing. One is, my family moved a lot growing up. We moved back and forth between England and the U.S., but we also lived internationally. And so I can so remember as a teenager trying to, well, particularly actually the move between England and the U.S., because culturally we're so similar, and also, there's very distinct differences, but they're subtler. they didn't stand out quite as much. And I remember with my younger sister, we went to boarding school in England, and just trying to work out the rules of the game. Like, and it's interesting because we knew there were rules. There was some kind of like way to operate that would allow us to, date or, navigate friendship. And so together we would, have these long conversations into the night about like, what the heck is going on here, and how do we navigate it? But those cultural disruptions, for sure, I know attuned me to, to probably looking for those patterns and looking for the differences, so that I could, be, effective or successful or happy. And I absolutely remember, it's like when we were just talking here about like maybe you move into a phase of knowing, and then you start to, encounter things that don't fit in the knowing, and that catalyzes a phase of not knowing, and that might bring us into a different coherence of knowing. And in my own life, I almost used to think of it like almost like I would, like a jungle gym in a way. Like I would kind of build a structure of how things worked and what was happening. And the moment I felt solid in it, I also, I came to recognize the pattern of like, it is the moment that it was about ready to go. Those moments of kind of confidence and stability didn't last very long. But yeah, there's a couple that stand out. I was studying environmental studies, ecology in undergrad, as I was mentioning, and we were mostly learning from a textbook. And I went to a ranch in Wyoming for a summer, and did some learning at the ranch, but also worked at the ranch. And all the categories that we had been taught about how, who ranchers were, who environmentalists are, the different kind of actors in an environmental issue just started to break down in a way that, at the time was confusing, but ultimately, again, was somewhat exhilarating. It was, I remember having the view that a rancher was, inherently not environmentalist. They might love the land, but they were making use of the land towards their own ends, versus myself, who, love the land in a different kind of a way. Anyway, so I had these kind of fixed categories of view that started to dismantle. And I imagine, from a sort of developmental perspective, that maybe I was starting to enter into the fourth person perspective in the stages model, the pluralist or redefining view in ego development, that I was starting to these kind of certainties, these binaries of either or were troubling themselves, and starting to take on more contextual elements of, oh, actually, I went out for a hike with one of the younger ranchers, and again, I feel almost embarrassed to say it. I was like, well, I'm an ecologist. I know all about the land, and wow, this guy like saw he saw so much more than I was ever going to see. And I had to like, oh yeah, of course. I mean, he's like living on this land. How could I imagine it would be, other than that? But yeah, I imagine that was coming into more of a kind of contextual view of recognizing, we've been raised in different contexts, and we're shaped by those contexts in ways that don't fit into a kind of more black and white either or thinking. So that was one of those developmental moves, and I could describe another, but maybe I'll pause there.
Yeah, I was thinking, reflecting on a few different examples as you were talking. It's I was remembering that, like, a while back I was kind of sorting through some stuff in our garage, and I had a box of some kind of old memorabilia, and there was a letter in there that I'd written to my father, like when I was in my early 20s. And this is kind of it's kind of a fun thing. I'm in my 60s now, and I look back at this, I'm like, who is this person? Like, just the way I was writing and talking, it seemed almost foreign to me. But I remember back in that time, like I was very much in a kind of very kind of, I would say, a little bit black and white, not like I was very intellectually engaged and really interested in philosophy and politics and the world, and I had very particular ideas about things. I had particular ideas about politics. And then the thing that really shifted for me was was when my first child was born. And I always mark it at that time. And I just mostly look back retrospectively, like all of a sudden everything kind of opened up. And I was much more interested in the diversity of things. I became interested in my inner life in a different kind of way, and religion and spirituality. But it was I wanted to survey everything. So I wanted to just look around 360 degrees. And that to me was a real shift, probably a shift into some kind of the same perspective you were talking about, Abigail. And then I was also thinking about later in my life when I kind of moved into what in the stages model is called the fifth person perspective, which is a kind of, moving beyond the ordinary personality as your organizing center. And prior to that, I was kind of in my own spiritual development, like on steroids. I was leading men's group. I was working with the spiritual teacher. I had all of these ambitions and practices and goals, and like the teacher I was working with, told me like I should make a 1-year plan for everything I'm doing, and was just okay. So I did that, and one of the things in the plan, it was like a lot of personal things, but one of the things in the plan is like I'm going to realize non-dual consciousness in 6 months. and it's like, and it was interesting because it had a catalytic like effect. It was like an impossible thing that I put on that piece of paper, because the I that wrote that statement had no way of achieving that goal, and but a few months later, the whole thing fell apart, and like it was like the rug came out from underneath my consciousness, and I was just sort of suspended over the abyss, and went through a dark night, and did awaken and did find that broader awareness, but it was so not like what I expected. It was a dissolution of the old self. And I remember at one point, I saw this teacher I was working with, and he said, "Oh, how's it going?" And I just said, like, "I don't know. I don't care about any of this stuff anymore. I don't care about your teaching or anything. I don't even know why I'm here." And he just sort of laughed and, gave me kind of a knowing look. But that was a really significant shift. But I think they all are, they all are significant shifts.
That sense of disillusion is very interesting. I remember a number of moments in my life where I would describe it as like a new floor was added to the house, but it has no furniture. And so the initial phases of experience was there's nothing here. Like something's changed. Maybe I'm a little higher up. There's a spaciousness. I have nothing to think about in this new mode. There's no things. I don't have a personality here yet.
A good,
And then
good,
over
good
time, I pick up
metaphor.
some things and vet them to
Mm-hmm.
see how they fit with me and like furnish that room. But the initial experience was always there's nothing going. Nothing. I have nothing.
And for a while, you can't find the staircase down.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's true.
The you mentioned spirituality, and there's a lot of subtle philosophical nuances about how states and developmental stage complexity might fit together, about how spirituality and growth might work together. Now, the work that you guys are doing, Awakened Wholeness, it's got these different facets, right? Some of them have to do with um, attuning to or releasing ourselves into something that seems like it's ever present. And some of it has to do with healing and integration dynamics that are roughly the same, no matter where you are in your journey or how complex or not you feel yourself to be. But then some of it has to do with some kind of stage like growth. What is it that you guys do to facilitate people's stage like growth? Like, how do you help them move along their appropriate complexity trajectory?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, um, as I am wont to do, we'll digress a little bit. um, yeah, I think that, but this is also a way of responding to what you're saying. There's something, and maybe we can come back to this in more depth, but there's something that, this particular topic provokes, which is, you said, how do you help people move along their appropriate stage development? And it that provokes a whole construction about hierarchy, more mature, less mature, growing up. We say grow up. It's sort of, that's what your older sibling would tell you when you're a little kid. There's the whole history of human perfection and all the ways that that's been created, and the way power structures are created in the world. So all of that kind of stuff is in the background when we say, how do we help people along? So I think part of one of the most important things is to allow that process to occur naturally. And it can be really helpful to have you could say a culture around that has some understanding of the territories of complexity and can hold people in that process, but is sensitive to what's natural and most needed with a person. So sometimes, and developmental growth is like happens slowly. It's it's so it's important to kind of attune to that pace of it. So, but some of the things that are, there are practices you can do at each stage that help cultivate stage development. But I would say one thing that's super important is when you are in that kind of, when you're in the level of your house where there isn't stuff up there, or there's a bunch of stuff that you don't know what it is, and is to have a kind of social context for that helps you make sense of it. And so, like, there's I'm thinking of people who've been in our programs who have moved into a stage, either something like what I was talking about, or into that fourth person perspective, but they haven't really had a rich social context for that, or cultural context for that helps bring that to life. That can be really supportive and really helpful. And to know that, oh, I can express myself from this place, I can relate from it, I can bring myself into the world from it. And that's really important, and I think also caring for the transitions, caring for the disorientation of transitions, and to which is holding people in what's falling apart, and in providing a map for what they're going through to help ground in it, and to support the emergence of a new view. Those types of things are helpful. There's specific developmental practices, like moving into the fourth person perspective. Keegan's immunity of change is a sort of classic practice that helps you look at your inner complexity, so that at each stage there's things that you can do. But I think those things are important, and it's important to kind of realize that development is a kind of all quadrant thing. It's not just something that I do, it's something that happens socially, it happens culturally, it happens in our communities together. And I could say more about that.
Yeah, I'll build on what you shared, Geoff. I'm just going to add a small piece to my story of being at the ranch, because it's relevant for what I'm going to say.
She's still back at the ranch.
The other part about my time at the ranch is I went 3 times over a 4-year period. So I also got to see myself grow, so I was there the first time, I went back the second time, and I could see some of that meaning making that I had been doing that was distorting my experience of the ranchers. Another piece I had was that they were, pardon the view, but I, had the view that they were sexist and I was a feminist. And I started to see that I had that view of them, and that by virtue of holding the view, I actually couldn't see who they actually were. So I was my own seeing, and that's, becomes more available at the fourth person perspective, was getting in the way of relationship. It was getting in the way of a more truthful relationship with who the person was in front of me. Which was a little bit stunning. It's a bit stunning to see that how we see somebody is shaping, our experience of them. It's it's a developmental move. But the reason I'm saying that is because, as can be true for some, when I came across the developmental perspective, it liberated so much. Like it helped me to understand and see myself in a particular kind of way, and understand the folks that I was working with in a more nuanced and as I experienced it, liberatory way. And so there's so much benefit there. But at the same time, how I and we are working with developmental theory and developmental models in our work is we're also reorienting a little bit. And one of the reasons I wanted to speak to that is because I think the developmental view, again, helps us to understand something, which I'm going to illustrate the understanding piece here in a moment. But also, if we fix around the categories, so this is kind of coming back to troubling the categories. If we get a little too fixed about the categories of what a stage of development looks and and how it's expressed and so forth, and we focused on it in a way that's a little bit more static or fixed, then we're also going to miss something important. So I just wanted to speak to that as I also spoke to how we are working with development in our work. It's a frame that that does informs the development of our, the development and delivery of our programs, and in particular in the Generating Transformative Change, the 9-month program. We hold a developmental view of how we're working with and meeting folks, and we. There's a couple things here. I mean, one is participants take a pre and post developmental assessment, and then there's a kind of learning about the developmental frame if that's something that they haven't engaged with before. So there alone is a developmental practice. It's starting to see those patterns reflected back to us, so that we can see that in action in ourselves, which makes can be quite catalytic for people. And then also, we're recognizing that there's always a developmental diversity in any group, and that diversity is actually part of the territory, the richness of learning. It's actually, we might come into a developmental program and think, okay, who's on the later end of the spectrum here, because that's who I want to learn from, or that's, where I'm headed. But actually, it's never that simple. And as we often say, it's not only does something new get revealed and liberated at a later developmental stage, capacity for, to engage with complexity, as we've been talking about, but also what matters is how healthy and whole we are, and what our conduct looks like. And so oftentimes in the groups that we're working with, there's always a developmental diversity, both in terms of where people are operating from, but also that range that we have in ourselves, how we show up moment to moment. And engaging with that diversity is part of the, on both ends of the spectrum, is part of the depth and the richness of the kind of the journey of becoming, and it's being conscious of that is one way to help us support our relative wholeness as we still situate and come from the the wholeness that's always present. So that's a piece that matters. And then the last thing I wanted to add in this moment, and you referenced this, Geoff, but to hold a program, an offering, a container, from a particular developmental view that offers a little bit more spaciousness, a little bit more ground, room for people to sort of unfold into. Oftentimes that the kind of latent growth that's been occurring for somebody, but maybe hasn't been held in a cultural context, as you were referencing, Geoff, just can happen with more ease. It's this kind of process of just like relaxing into who we already are, but maybe we haven't been able to fully experience in different contexts in our lives. and then that holding of, helping people to see when they're in those transitions, and that, that we're not only falling apart, but actually something might be falling together, is, can just be profoundly stabilizing, profoundly supportive.
So I'm hearing the need for the uh, interpersonal reinforcement, the social dimension of it, and the need to hold developmental processes lightly or give them enough wiggle room. We don't necessarily understand how it's going to work. It's a complex process. There are a couple of things from the ranch adventure, though, that stand out to me as key principles. Um, One was the notion of returning, going back to the ranch, because sometimes we say depth when we mean something like complexity. And it seems to me that depth is something you can only really gauge when you're returning to something, right? You can, if you read a new book, you might have widened your knowledge base, but you have to reread the same book to know if you got deeper on that understanding.
Hmm.
So repetition, uh, nuance, your realization that the rancher is seeing more things in the environment than you are, that's really important, I think, because a lot of my experience of complexity is an ongoing process of realizing that there were multitudes of details where previously I saw one thing. And then I have to somehow make sense of the manyness, of the richness of all those details. And the other thing was your realization, and probably to some degree an emotional dissatisfaction with seeing that your seeing is being obstructed, right? That, oh, this is
Hmm.
getting in the way of relating. This is getting in the way of seeing. And not only that fact, but I don't want that. I wish to see more. I wish to have this barrier removed, so that there's an emotional driver of this process as well. Some of it might just happen with children, just aging seems to do a lot of it. But for adults, how much of it is also, how much do you have to want it?
Hmm. Ooh, it's a good question. Yeah, I was reflecting on that after we talked recently, and just reflecting on the sort of the sort of evolutionary impulse idea as a kind of foundational view, and reflecting on my own inner experience of that on this kind of, I used to have a teacher. He said, would say like the universe is restless, and that kind of feeling of restlessness or wanting or desiring, or that motivation to me has been so much a part of my own life, and I feel in the work that we do, it's always there in the people that we're working with. It might be covered up in defenses or cynicism or resignation to some degree, but to me, wanting, desire is like maybe one of the animating forces. Now, the it part is tricky because, like, one thing I say about, these kind of significant shifts is my experience is it's never what you thought it was. And, but that desire, so if the desire, it doesn't really matter what the it is, it'll take you, even if it just sort of takes you down a rabbit hole, that desire is really important. Yeah. And, the love, the tension, the suffering, the grappling and struggling with, things that don't make sense. And I mean, just look out at the world, it's like there's a lot of struggle going on, which means there's a lot of desire there, you know. Otherwise we'd be just going, oh, it doesn't matter, just live my life. Some people are doing that, but I think it's important. Is that what you're asking? That kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm also curious, and maybe Abigail can speak to this, not just about uh, the role of eros and the fact that eros is present where suffering is present, but about just the
Not interested in your little philosophical games.
Let's
Talk to
take that as a given.
Abigail.
There was something in Abigail's anecdote that spoke to me about, the frustration, and the self identity of, like, I should be able to see, I should be able to connect. It's one of my values,
Yeah.
and if I encounter this felt limit, I feel like I got to do something about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that I have more to add. I mean, I would just say, I could I'm actually really enjoying revisiting this time in my life. So it's I didn't expect to be talking about it so much. But yeah, it's from the place of suffering around, here I was, this little environmentalist hippie type, dropped in a kind of conservative cultural context, and I was lonely. I was lonely, and also I had these values about connection and bridging differences, and but yeah, it was both, and so it's both in a sense an expression of love, which was being thwarted, and also an expression of the kind of loneliness, the isolation of they love to make jokes about me, which was so great that they did. About my Birkenstocks and my vegetarianism and my but that actually, of course, was an expression of love, and I knew it, and it helped me to laugh about myself, but yeah, it's a social isolation. Absolutely. And the felt sense that something else was going on.
I'm wondering whether complexity is the right word, right? Obviously, it's just a word tool, but
Yeah.
we have to distinguish it from complicated, or people like to make that distinction and go, no, we mean the starfish, not an engine you don't know how to fix. At the same time, it has some distinction from simplicity, but then we're not anti-simple, so we have to say things like the simplicity and complexity, and then a second simplicity on the other side. Or I like to say simplexity, and it'll bring them really close together, and it helps me connect it to computational dynamics as well. Because, like, you have a little tiny bit of program, and it produces an endless fractal on the other side. You're like, oh, these are the same somehow. The simple thing and the complex thing are always coupled together. How do you guys, is complexity the right word? How do you relate it to its opposites? What's not
Mm.
complexity?
Well, that same teacher that said the universe is restless used to say that all words are half a lie. It's just whenever you say something, what's absent is present, and it's a limitation of language. And to me, in the seven facets, each of those facets is a whole world. It's like, and and we grappled with the word for this one, because it's a little tricky. It's, I mean, and part of our holding of this in our work is to in a way to negate it, to trouble it, and to trouble the hierarchy. To me, what's missed in that is, like, the view that Jeremy Johnson expresses and through Gebser's work, of that these, like, as I understand it, Gebser said that these aren't really like stages, they're like planets revolving around a sun, which is the ever-present origin. They're like structures that we move through. They're like, layers, like layers of the body, and what's also missing is the simplicity, the simplicity before complexity, which is also really important. Like I often think of the phrase pass the butter, which is a very, like, you learn to say that, when you're like 5 years old, and, like we don't like say, like that I'm like attuning to the cosmic eros, and it's expressing itself through me as a desire for butter, which I want to enter into our social field and allow the butter to emerge on my side of the table. We're we just say like, pass the fucking butter, please. Which is it's no different than anything else. Like all these views are at some level are like they're part of our system, and and so something that needs to be troubled, what gets missed is that, sometimes like what I suggest, is like, you know, can you just be an ordinary boy, Layman? It's part of life too. But this is a good question. It's a good question. I like the question about the word, and also the question about, what's missed. Uh, and I love your image about the dark room, because that's it, in a way. That's a kind of the subjective experience of becoming familiar with that there's worlds that we don't know. And so to me, I guess in a way, the growth is also, maybe it's like that growth from kind of knowledge to wisdom. There's a growth to releasing complexity too, which is just as important, to realizing like at a certain point you go like, okay, I'm never going to figure this out. Just going to live my life. Not as an alternative to figuring it out, but as another aspect of like human experience.
You used the word layers as a Jeremy Johnson Gebser reference. I like that word a lot more than levels and stages myself. And it
Yeah,
brings up for me a sort of, I tend to put three different versions of layered complexity on the table in front of myself, because we cosmologically, individually, there's these different informational regimes, these layers. So we make sense in different ways at different times. So one way to think about complexity is just that there's more layers in the stack of layers. You go, okay, maybe that's what I mean by complexity. Another way of thinking about it is, well, the top layer is supposed to transcend and include all the other layers, even though it doesn't perfectly do that, because it leaves some things out and emphasizes some, de-emphasizes others, repurposes some, things like that. But the layer that, right, so rather than just the number of layers, it's how well it's encasing the other ones. Maybe that one
mm-hmm.
layer is the
Mm-hmm.
complexity. And then this other way of thinking, like, well, how well are these layers talking to each other? How much sort
Mm-hmm.
of reciprocal exchange is going on? And
Yeah,
maybe what I mean by complexity is how aligned, how good a team these different layers are, because some people might speak from an ability to recognize patterns that's many layers up a stack, but it seems like they don't know very much viscerally about the underlayers in their own stack. So when I'm thinking
absolutely.
complexity, I'm sort of thinking of those three in some
Uh,
communication with each other.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, I was going to respond to Abigail. Did you want to say
No,
something?
no, please do. I love what you said about the underlayers in the stack. It's a
So
nice way of
important.
expressing it. And I'm imagining, I just wanted to clarify for, when you said the top layer, are you talking about the top layer that somebody has access to, or do you mean like the kind of penultimate?
I mean, yeah, wherever an individual's sort of
Yeah,
most
yeah.
functional leading edges.
That's what
We don't.
I
Yeah,
imagined.
I don't know
Yeah.
if we know whether there's a overall
Right.
top layer or not. It's
yeah,
debatable.
Yeah. Doesn't
yeah.
seem like it.
um, yeah, no, no, it's really important what you're saying. Like the whole thing of transcend and include really obscures the way in which we can become dissociated from these different structures of consciousness. And something I think of is like if we really transcended and included all the previous stages, we would all be perfect parents, because as a 30-year-old parent of a 5-year-old child, we would look at our child and go like, I know exactly what they're experiencing, and yet for the most part, it takes work. And even if you study, developmental psychology, and you're a parent, and then you can start to get a cognitive understanding of it. But like going back and actually knowing what that reference point is and feeling it in your own experience, like animating, your own magical or mythical consciousness, and to the point of having it being like a real living part of your life. That's not given, and I just, the thought I had of that was like, when I spent years, we both did, working with a practice of somatic psychology, and then eventually training in it, and so we'd have people who were kind of, relatively developed, but we would have experience of like regressing to being a baby, and going back into that animistic layer of ourselves and experiencing what it is like to just be absorbed in sensory experience without the reflective mind happening. This isn't like the integration and the vitality of and the embrace of all these dimensions of ourself is the descent into these layers, which is obscured by fascination with vertical growth. And to me, it's like really so important. Does that touch on what you were bringing up?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. You said the three things, and I wasn't sure what those three things were. So I just took a stab at it. Maybe I landed on one of them.
Yeah, it's the I think probably we all lean a little bit more towards that third one, in terms
Yeah.
of what's engaging and juicy and useful for people.
Yeah. What were the other two? What were the three
Just like
things?
just how many layers in your stack that you have, or how how much you're identified with your top layer, if it
Right.
supposedly enfolds the
Right.
other ones, and then
Right.
how well are these layers actually mutually functioning, talking to each other and aligned.
Right. 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 Well, it's a, kind of paradoxical. I think your identification with your stage is also something that wanes over time, which you can take the perspective that that's a developmental move, becoming less, you know, like fixated on a particular stage, or it may just be part of some other movement of more, wisdom or maturity that's letting go of all of this, or having less identification. There's different ways to look at it.
Yeah, I sometimes we try to make a single complex variable out of integration and complication, or like integration and diversity, because it seems like if there's some growth that's like layers in a person, it has to involve finding more data, recognizing more kinds of things, but it also has to bring them together. Otherwise, it's just a grab bag of recognized
Mm-hmm.
things. But it
Yeah.
does feel to me as if those variables operate a little bit independently. Sometimes a person goes through a phase, often when they're seeming to enter a stage of development, and it seems like everything in their life suddenly seems like it's super connected. Synchronicities are everywhere. It's all integrated. And later, they haven't lost their new recognition of the diversity of things, but they might not experience it as being as integrated, right? There might be natural phases, or there might be adjustments between how much of the complication is foregrounded and how much of the integration is foregrounded.
Hmm. I'll have to think about that one.
Likewise.
The
All
complication
right,
is
here's another thing to
foregrounded in
think
this
about.
moment.
I'm here to trouble the categories.
Okay, good. Yeah, trouble away. I'm all about it.
All right, here's the thing that stands out to me a lot, which is one of the ways we often think about what how complexity operates is that there's an increase and an integration of perspectives. And that's a really cool way to think about it, because
Mm-hmm.
there's these embodied sense making modalities, and there's somebody there, someone's having an experience, there's an angle, there's an entity. It's not just a random proliferation of abstraction. And it's great for trying to take seriously the perspectives of others, other human beings, other ranges of creatures, other parts in yourself that might have a sensibility of their own, or maybe it's just optimal for you to engage them as if they have a sensibility of their own. I find that super useful, super tidy, super simple. But I feel like what often gets left out is uh, drives, energy, the struggle between forces within the individual, right? The
Mm-hmm.
experiences of contradiction and conflict. And right, it's one thing if I talk myself into appreciating this modality and appreciating this modality. It's another thing if I feel torn between two
Mm-hmm.
things that I'm now experiencing as both valid, so I can't choose between them. And it's there's a real ordeal involved in that. There's real struggle involved in developmental maturation in a lot of ways. And I
Yeah.
find that in myself and often in people that I work with, I end up prioritizing intentional self struggle and the experiential complexity of threshold conditions more than I focus on um, learning to make sense of other angles, other perspectives.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying, that you would see a kind of there's a developmental view that is about including those other perspectives and synthesizing them in a way, but that you personally are prioritize the struggle or the tension that might be resolved by that synthesis. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah, and I like I have found a lot of utility and still do in what I would think of as perspective approaches, where I might
Mm-hmm.
try to take things from a different angle. I might try to engage in some inner dialogue with a part, make sense of its other perspective. But then there's a thing that happens where I'm torn, or there's uncertainty, or there's inner conflict, and I
Yeah,
sort of have a choice to back away, suffer from it, or like lean into it and just without even thinking what these perspectives are, just try to hold two forces together and see if I can get
yeah,
them to coordinate more.
yeah, yeah. What's your question about that?
No question. It's just a distinction I find comes up for me a lot. How about you guys?
How's that working out for you, Layman? No, yeah, no, I really relate to that. Like as a sort of Enneagram 4, like if there's the way out of the hole is to dig, and to go deeper, and to be in the struggle. And I think it's a really important part. And to come back to how we're holding development in our work, is we spoke about a kind of embracing kind of approach of allowing people's process to unfold naturally, and that might sound like a kind of softening thing, but what it's actually also doing is making way more space for those contradictions, to be in those contradictions, to be present to the tensions and the confusion and the struggle without trying to resolve them. Because I think when you're working on including different perspectives, that's a more often than not, it's a kind of your whatever wherever you are in your present structure operating to grapple with the situation and reduce the tension of it. But the real growth in our own complexity comes through those struggles. It comes through when we can't make sense, of something. And I think that sometimes that struggle or that confusion or contradiction leads to a greater complexity, and sometimes it leads to other sites of insight, other kinds of insights, more integration, more openness to the complexity of reality, more layers of confusion, you know. Um, and but in that, you're growing something which to me is an artifact of all of this, which is more equanimity in the face of things that we don't understand, or equanimity, and not in the sense of like calm nervous system, but equanimity in the sense of openness to reality, which to me is part of our what's our potential, to be here, be with what's happening.
One of the things I've found myself engaging with more recently is I've been doing some work with John Kessler's integral polarity practice, and just appreciating the way that if I or someone I'm with is struggling with something, to look for like what's the polar partner that's also present but maybe hasn't actually gotten named. And so in a way that's almost like it's like inviting in, additional perspectives on the moment to find a deeper wholeness that, that's already there but is obscured by the maybe the intensity of the one aspect of the experience that's really dominating. And I've been surprised actually at how much that's kind of opened things up or brought things forward into their own natural wholeness. So, for example, experiencing anger recently, and almost intentionally bringing in the kind of cooling waters of a kind of peacefulness, which is part of my self structure as a Enia type 9. And I could, as a 9, got this kind of peacekeeping dimension to myself that I might seek to keep at bay because it wants to resolve conflict before the conflict has really grown me into the view that might be able to that can see through the conflict. But anyway, in this case, like really experiencing anger and bringing in the cooling waters and seeing how they dance together, and in their dance together, there was some kind of a deeper resolution that just presented itself. And it's maybe I'm just expressing something in my own unfolding processes. Like it's kind of a counterintuitive move. Like, oh, can I bring in a sense, more complexity, more aspects of an experience to find the kind of deeper wisdom or the way through.
Yeah, that's interesting to me because there's part of complexification that seems like it's an unveiling or a creating of new patterns, new ways of seeing. And the part of it is a greater range of capacities relative to your pre-existing parts. Like how well do you
Mm.
recognize them? How well can you move them around to adjust each other for different situations? Like a gaining of like a general fluency of the forces that make up the self.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of the paradoxes that we're like, that's the, if you want to say transcend and include, there's a transcend part, but there's also embracing, including, that's in some ways that's like where the real work is, is embracing and integrating and making more sense of what's, those earlier territories. Um, I have a question for you, Layman. I'm curious about one of the things I've been thinking about is just how this interplays with the larger kind of cultural development and social development and technology. And, there's so much, if you, a simple way to think about this topic is how we can become less polarized in ourselves or in our relationships. It's finding that kind of greater synthesis. And so we're now in this kind of world where the thing that we're always saying about what's going on is we're like pathologically polarized in our society, and there's threads of that into technology and culture and politics and all of that. And I've just been thinking about kind of the interplay between the topic that we're talking about, which is often framed just in a kind of personal, psychological, or social way, into the larger world. What do you think about that? Like,
And I think the general principles of depth and nuance and integration and complexity uh, are useful and need to be deployed in every domain. I think the individuals in the world that we're sort of emerging into, there's so many forces now that can hack your internal experience. So that just as a survival mechanism, rather than as a spiritual or developmental luxury, we might say, you have to complexify your relationship to your own opinions, responses, etc. Right? Like if your machines and other motivated people or the system in general is coming at you, trying to trick you on purpose, using your morals, your emotions, your recognition
yeah,
patterns, just to survive, we have to become more complex. Like we have to say no to a lot of our own natural responses, knowing that they're being hacked, and then that's doubling of that experience forces us into a situation where we have to make more complex patterns. I think there is a recognition coming from a lot of the sciences that many of the patterns we need to make human and ecological thriving possible are not patterns we can recognize. Like they reach the limit of our ability to cognize them or simplify them.
Mm,
So we need to be able to, I think, get out of the civilization cul-de-sac we're in. We need to draw on our computational allies to make sense of patterns that we can't recognize.
mm,
But I also think a lot of it is has to do with the relationship of the noosphere and the biosphere, we might say, right? That billions of years of ecology have demonstrated a pretty successful, pretty reliable, adaptive complexity engine. Uh, it has had better and worse times, but there are a lot of good solutions there. And I think we need to sort of import or colonize the noosphere with the kind of complexity we see in the biosphere. Right. And
mm,
that means turning more of its patterns into the information that our systems are making sense of
mm,
rather than just
mm.
feeding our systems on human speech acts.
Yeah,
Right. I
yeah.
think we could make our tools serve that kind of patterning. And I
Hmm.
think we need to. And in some ways, I imagine that that's what Gaia wants us to do. That's sort of
Yeah, yeah,
my
yeah.
imaginal story.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I love that. That's really cool. Yeah, well, look forward to continuing that angle, that conversation. Yeah, it's and also like the yeah, the need to be aware, to have the complexity to be aware of what you're pointing to, that the systems that are, as you said, like hacking our consciousness, our motive, using our motives for its own purposes, that kind of complexity is like super important. And then maybe the situation that we're in is helping grow that complexity. So that's something I think about, is just that interrelationship between the social, technological, cultural systems and how we grow up. And this is in our work, which is on a much smaller scale, it relates to one of the facets that's really important in its connection with complexity is the collective work, because at that level it's really about cultivating a broader, one of the primary ways that we are polarized is in the various forms of self and other, self and tribe, self and group, one and many, as a kind of polar opposite. And this is, we see it's just like really deeply embedded in our own psychology. Even the stories about the ranch really kind of feed into that there's a greater whole, but even a greater whole beyond the I and the we. That there's a kind of a larger, and in your riffing on the larger world, it could be, looking at the noosphere and the ecosphere and an even wider we that's holding all of that. And so as we start to develop that complexity in our communities, to understand that that I'm not in a group that I need to reckon whether I can feel safe in or fit in, or that I'm actually, that the we and the I are kind of co-creating each other all of the time. And then we can start to practice in our own worlds this kind of greater complexity that opens a kind of agency at an individual level, because we can free ourselves inside of the collectives that we're in, but also opens an agency at the collective level where we can allow our communities and tribes and collectives to be free in their own acting in the world and find a greater unity there. That's a real essential piece of our work. And I think it's, I'm going to reflect on this, but I think it's connected to what you're pointing to. And I'm also just interested in this idea of, like the natural patterns and how they can influence even our work, what I'm speaking about.
Two more things came up for me there, which were, there you see this with children too, like they need enough support in order to be able to take on a challenge, right? So we need enough collectively, we need enough coherence, enough sort of sacred shared ethos to be able to absorb more diversity, to allow ourselves to be complexified. And we don't have that, then polarization becomes the dominant mode.
Yeah.
And so we have to be sort of templating communities of various kinds where a higher level of coherence is possible so that there's something to hold a greater amount of complexification. And then the other thing that came up was around words and polarization. So let's say we have a word that we think we know, and then something happens in us, we grow, we change, and that word doesn't seem applicable anymore. We have a choice that's related to our temperament. One choice is I don't use that word anymore. I use this new word, this other word, or I made up a new word. And the other one is no, I take that meaning and I
Mhm.
reinscribe it as the meaning of that word. And you can say that's a bit like a progressive or a conservative difference in people. And I think it's
Mm.
important to be able to serve both because some people will like understand beyond their mythology and dump it and go, well, I'm a rational atheist world centric person now. And other people will say, no, that's exactly what my mythology meant all along. I'm going to double down on that. And so we need
Mm.
to be aware that there's growth and complexity in both of these modes as a way of reducing that polarization.
Yeah, I love that. I love that in the, this is a maybe a simple response to it, but I love it in the form of, thinking about what it means to be a citizen, thinking what it means to be, a member of, of a particular nation, that kind of a thing, to be able to reconfigure what we mean by that so that we can actually, widen and deepen to include more of the whole. It feels so fundamental. And yeah, just appreciate you pointing to it.
Yeah, I think both of that impulse to curate and cultivate, communities that reanimate that kind of coherence and connection as a way of seeding a new culture is something that's really central to our work. We're and is happening in a number of different venues, obviously in your work too, and that the thing that you said about words just kind of points to a similar thing of like that kind of difference in unity, and both of those, that balance, that dynamic. I mean, this is something that Diane Hamilton expresses so eloquently, like in collective work, we're in this tension between, sameness and difference, like creating coherence, stability, safety, and allowing diversity, and those two interplay together. And ultimately, I think we can recognize they're two sides of the same coin and find a deeper coherence that's always present and which allows for more diversity. And yeah, and I think that to me, I maybe if I have like was interesting that you said it was a kind of constitutional preference. I think maybe I've had different preferences at different times in my life, but um, it's I think I maybe most recently my preference has been more that kind of like finding ways to speak that cut across, which is more like having a mythology that is kind of that speaks to different perspectives that can be reformulated, that can be understood, in the way that the great spiritual traditions are constantly reinterpreted and reformulated, and people with seemingly vastly different points of view look at one thing and see themselves in it. To me, that's a really important thing for us, to be able to come together. But also the downside is that it papers over distinctions, and so I think there's a kind of, I think in our work, we're moving more to drawing the boundaries more clearly and using the words to mean what we want them to mean. And so yeah, so I think that's I recognize what you're talking about.
Probably at the end, is there anything else we need to say about complexity today?
I feel like we've covered it. Abigail, do you want to take one more trip back to the ranch? We haven't considered
I
the
do.
point of
I
view of the
do.
cows and the
Yeah,
grass.
not in
What's
our
it like to be a
conversation.
field of grass?
But I do want to revisit the ranch in real life. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's the first
Yeah.
place I fell in love with the land and even realized that that's possible. I remember waking up one morning when I was there, and my heart was so filled with the beauty of the place, and I was like, "Oh my God, how come nobody told me this too was possible?" That was a beautiful moment, beautiful awakening experience in its own
Mm.
way. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, maybe I just say something about that. I just appreciate the relationship, the dynamic between complexity and simplicity. You talked about the simplicity prior to and the simplicity, post complexity, and yeah, it's just where my heart is these days. Maybe it's like there was a time in my life where I just felt, and I can still feel it pulling at me, the desire to try to express things in such a way that it honors the complexity, that it brings in as many perspectives as is possible and doesn't leave anyone out. And, there's a kind of probably, I mean, this is my own self, I suppose, my own journey, but just drawn a little bit more to letting all that go and just being a little bit more, simply truthful in the moment and knowing. And this to me brings up another piece, which is it's like both the humility of the not being able to know, and then also the necessarily relational dimension of what it means to engage in complexity, that we can release ourselves from trying to understand and express it all, because we're actually we're deeply interdependent not to, and so we can only do this together in relationship.
Mm.
And there's just a release for me in that is very welcome.
Yeah, that's really good to know,
Complexity
to
mediates
end on.
a building up and a letting go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, sometimes Layman, I'm inspired by what you're saying, Abigail. It's just that it doesn't seem complex. It seems like in some way I mean, of course it is complex. I understand we're dealing with a very complex situation, but it also seems like what we're trying to do is just be good people, you know, and to understand each other and to understand what's important, and and to create together, to trust ourselves, and at all these different levels, yeah, yeah. I mean, like I heard Destin DePerno say recently, like what really matters is whatever level we're seeing the world from, that we're healthy and whole and contributing in a positive way. So that's a simplicity that I often return to.
Okay. See you next month, chums.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks. Thanks for being in it with us, Layman.
Yeah, thank
This
you.
is great. I enjoed this one.
Yeah,
Not that I
me
didn't
too.
enjoy the other ones, but I really
Yeah.
enjoyed this
Yeah,
one.
what was the matter with the other ones? Oh, me too. Me too. Yeah. Well, we're getting in a rhythm, so that's good. Yeah. Take care. All
Thank
right. Be
you.
well, friend.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.
Bye bye.